On January 1st, 1937, the Washington Naval Treaty and the First London Treaty expired. At the same time, the Second London Treaty went into effect. But Japan didn't sign that treaty. As such, Japan wasn't limited by it and was now free to build whatever size carrier they wanted and could. I'll add this to my evidence pile that the Second London Treaty was a stupid treaty. Anytime you sign an arms limitation treaty with your allies, but not your potential enemies, you should probably re-examine your foreign policy. So, on December 12, 1937, with Soryu almost commissioned and Hiryu well underway, Japan started the first of the two 25,675-ton Shokaku Class. Okay, we've got a lot to unpack here. Right off the bat, since these two were so active, I'm just going to make this a catch-all for the battle histories of all the Japanese frontline carriers. It might also help paint a better picture of who did what, when, and with who. Part of their longevity has to be due to A, not being caught arming and fueling aircraft, B, not being hit below the waterline. And yes, after this, we'll go back to the anti-submarine escorts. There is lots about Japanese carriers out there. Not so much about Japanese submarines and escorts, but they served too. Not as flashy, but despite their bad press, Japanese submarines did okay. They could have done better, of course, but considering their limitations, they served well. Sank Yorktown and Wasp, kept Saratoga out of Coral Sea, Midway, and Santa Cruz, kept North Carolina out of Santa Cruz and the naval battles of Guadalcanal, sunk Indianapolis, sunk Juneau, sunk Liscum Bay, and the list goes on. Same with the ASW escorts. They had a hand in sinking a few U.S. submarines. It was thankless work, but again, considering what they had to work with, they did their best. Anyway, despite now being free of any limits, these ships were not clean slate designs. The Japanese seemed fairly happy with the design of Hiryu, so simply enlarged and improved it to meet their wants. Both were completed with the island on the starboard side. Running with doing their own thing, like most other Japanese carriers, the funnels came out the starboard side and cranked downward. Sure, why not? I guess it frees up deck space and is less weight topside. Being purpose-built and treaty-free, they could carry about as many aircraft as the 10,000-ton heavier, though about the same size, Akagi. Interestingly, for various reasons, they were the last Japanese carriers to have 3 elevators. Though in my personal opinion, they weren't laid out very well as the forward elevator wasn't at the end of the hangar. I guess you could argue this means it could be loaded or unloaded from the front or back, but that's just me. On the very upside, despite having 2 hangars stacked, they had no top weight problems. Like the Americans, they had wooden flight decks. They also used the hangar as superstructure idea. Unlike the Americans, they had very little side openings. The former made them easier to repair, something that would come in handy for Shokaku. The later would bottle up the hangar, something that would doom Shokaku. Along with the later Taiho, they were the Japanese' most powerful ships. And by that, I don't mean firepower. I mean horsepower. They even had more horsepower than the better than double the weight Yamatos. And for it, they were less than 10 knots faster. A glaring example of how expensive those last few knots on the top end are. Operationally, they were arguably Japan's best carriers. Undoubtedly, their most active. Mostly because of this, many, myself included, consider them to be their favorite Japanese carriers or even Japanese ships of any kind. Yes, they eventually succumbed to the American juggernaut, but especially Zuikaku seemed to live up to her name of the Lucky Crane. This was despite initial distrust of them. Not the carriers themselves, but rather their newly formed air groups at the time of the Pearl Harbor raid had their competencies questioned by the more senior flyers on the other large carriers. This is understandable, as Pearl Harbor was their first operational deployment, but they proved themselves as during their 3 carrier battles in 1942, the ships themselves, though not their air groups, left each battle in better shape than their American adversaries. Shokaku was also the first large Japanese carrier to get radar while undergoing repairs in the middle of 1942, though its reliability was questionable. Okay, let's get this out of the way. Why wasn't Zuikaku at Midway? Some would say lack of available air crew or something about breaking up the carrier division, and those would be perfectly valid. Some of the survivors of the Coral Sea were transferred to the other large carriers to replace their losses. This reduced her already depleted air group even more. More on that in a bit. But that doesn't really tell the whole tale. The real reason was the Japanese just didn't think they would need her. The A-team was on the job, and they expected surprise to be total. Give her the day off. An interesting idea I've read, I'm not saying I believe it, was that these two were originally planned as replacements for Akagi and Kaga. Submitted for your approval. On the one hand, Akagi and Kaga were just finishing major rebuilds when these two were started. On the other hand, despite only being in service since the late 20s, their hulls were originally started in the early 20s, which means by the time Sho and Zui were completed, they were 20 years old. Also being conversions, the older carriers weren't as efficient per ton as the purpose-built ships. Furthermore, the Japanese did tend to prefer the box structure. 4 Kongos paired with 4 battleships, the Fusos and Isseis, followed by 2 Nagatos and 2 Kagas paired with 4 Magis, 4 Yamatos. Most heavy cruiser classes had 4 ships. If this is true, it would have given them 4 large carriers, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, along with 4 light carriers, Ryujo, Shoho, Zuiho, and Ryuho. Finally, it would explain why only 2 were built. Yeah, the commitment to war and then the fighting of tossed that idea in the blender, but it kind of makes sense. Again, I'm not saying I believe it. I'm just not ready to say I don't believe it either. Shokaku was started December 12, 1937, and was completed August 8, 1941. Zuikaku was started May 25, 1938, and was completed September 25, 1941. Main armament was 16 127mm 40 caliber dual-purpose guns in 8 twin mounts, with a pair of mounts more or less at each corner. Armor was thin, but they were aircraft carriers, so, Side armor was 46 millimeters outboard of the machinery and 165 millimeters outboard of the magazines. The armored deck was the lower hangar floor and was 90 millimeters, thinning to 25 millimeters at the ends, but increasing to 132 millimeters over the magazines. They had a shallow 3-layer TDS backed with a 76 millimeter holding wall thinning to 25 millimeters. Propulsion was provided by 8 boilers in 2 rooms, each room venting to one of the 2 funnels that cranked out the starboard side and downward. These provided steam to the 4 turbines. Each ran its own propeller to generate 160,000 horsepower for a speed of 34 knots. They had 1 rudder. The flight deck was 242.2 meters by 29 meters. The upper hangar was 190 meters by 20 meters and 4.8 meters high. The lower hangar was 160 meters by 20 meters and 4.8 meters high. The forward elevator was 13 meters by 16 meters. The middle and after elevators were 13 meters by 12 meters. Aircraft complement varied, but a safe average was 27 fighters, 27 dive bombers, and 18 torpedo planes, with some being stored as reserved aircraft. Modifications were fairly limited as they were new at the start of the war and saw pretty heavy action. While undergoing repairs after the Battle of the Coral Sea, Shokaku was fitted with the new Type 21 radar atop her island. While it's generally held Zuikaku got hers at the same time, the folks over at CombinedFleet.com, unsolicited shameless plug there, assert this didn't happen until December 1942. With photographic evidence being rare, Japan's industrial capacity, and the quality of their other work, I'm inclined to believe them. While undergoing repairs after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Zuikaku received concrete protection around her avgas tanks, the Type 13 radar, and 6 of the new 28-cell AA rocket launchers. Upon completion of their acceptance trials and training cruises, in late 1941, both joined Kitabutai in the Kuriles and set off on the Pearl Harbor raid. Ryujo, meanwhile, covered the invasion of the Philippines, while the aircraftless Zuiho stayed home until Midway. The force returned to Japan near the end of December, with Soryu and Hiryu detouring to support the second invasion of Wake on the way back. In January, they covered the invasion of the New Britain Rabaul Northern Solomons area, returning home at the end of the month, while Ryujo covered the invasion of Malaya. For most of February and March of 1942, while the other 4 big carriers and Ryujo were raiding Darwin and supporting the invasion of Indonesia, they remained in home waters, the newly converted Shoho being sent to truck. Only occasionally did they sail to intercept American carriers that had raided Japanese-held islands, trying to find a battle where they could sink carriers. But of course, they were always too late, so returned home empty-handed. In April, minus Kaga, which had to spend most of April and May being repaired after grounding on February 9th, they were back with Kitabutai and sailed into the Indian Ocean, where they raided Sri Lanka, sinking the small British carrier Hermes and the cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire along the way. Ryujo, meanwhile, operated to the north, raiding the Bay of Bengal. After the raid, while the other 4 carriers returned to Japan to prepare for the Battle of Midway and the Aleutians, they headed south to Truk so they could support the invasion of New Guinea. On May 7th-8th, the Battle of the Coral Sea heated up, the first of only half a dozen carrier versus carrier battles in history. Without going too far into the details, by the end of the battle, the independently operating Shoho was sunk, its first and only major action, as was the American Lexington, with Yorktown moderately damaged. Meanwhile, Shokaku had taken 3 1,000-pound bombs. One exploded at the bow, starting fires, wrecking the bow, causing flooding, and blowing the anchors off. Another hit midship just after the island, bending the mast, jamming the forward elevator, and starting fires. A third hit the starboard end of the flight deck, adding to the damage and starting more fires. Yes, she did manage to get back home, but nearly foundered doing it. It is a testament to her design and crew that she managed to sail from the Coral Sea all the way to Japan in such a condition. Zuikaku, meanwhile, briefly stayed in the area, ready to continue the fight, until the lack of American carriers meant there was no fight to continue. So she also returned to Japan. The later arrival of Enterprise and Hornet canceled the operation completely. Some historians call this battle a draw. Some call it a tactical victory for Japan, but a strategic victory for the Allies. I'm not so generous to Japan, and here's why. Strategically, they failed to capture New Guinea. Tactically, Lexington's replacement was already under construction. CV-16. Japan never got close to commissioning its 16th fleet carrier. Most importantly, though, and unappreciated at the time, was the aircrew bleeding. Japan started the war with about 760 combat-experienced carrier aircrew. Write that number down on a Post-it note and stick it to the side of your screen as we go. For various reasons, it will never go up. At the start of the battle, Japan brought about 170-ish aircraft on its 3 carriers. By the end, it had just 45. That means the entire air groups of Shoho and Shokaku were wiped out, as was 40%-ish of Zuikaku's. So from that 760 number, you can go ahead and subtract 90. Next up for the Japanese carriers at the start of June was the Battle of Midway, during which Shokaku was under repairs and Zuikaku was guarding the pier, referred to earlier. Again, I don't think I need to go over how Midway went, but in summary, you can subtract Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu along with 110 from your tally. Zuiho, meanwhile, was with the invasion force, while Ryujo and the new Junyo were supporting the Aleutians' conquest. In mid-June, Zuikaku sailed north to reinforce the Aleutians' invasion fleet, in case the Americans decided to follow up their victory at Midway there. But when nothing developed, they were back home by the end of the month. In mid-August, with Shokaku repaired, they and Ryujo ran back down to the Solomons and straight into the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, leaving Zuiho, Junyo, and the new Hiyo behind. While Shokaku and Zuikaku escaped damage, the independently operating Ryujo was sunk in exchange for damaging Enterprise. Oh yeah, you can subtract another 61. So numerically anyway, one of these two effectively had their entire air groups wiped out. Again, with the battle over and their air groups depleted, they pulled into Truk and essentially stayed there re-equipping until mid-October when, now joined by Junyo, Hiyo, and Zuiho, they sailed south to seek battle with American carriers in support of the upcoming land battle on Guadalcanal. Things started to go bad on the 21st when a fire broke out in Hiyo's generator room, forcing her to abort and return first to Truk, then to Japan for repairs that would last until March of 1943. On October 26th, the Battle of Santa Cruz took place. By the end of the battle, Hornet was sunk and Enterprise was moderately damaged. On the Japanese side, Zuiho had taken 2 500-pound bombs. Zuikaku again managed to escape any hits. Shokaku, again, wasn't as lucky though. Somewhere between 4 and 6 1,000-pound bombs hit her almost simultaneously. In my opinion, this puts her in the running for most heavily damaged carrier to survive. Probably a key factor was that at the time her avgas lines were shut off and ammunition was stowed. Thanks in part to her radar detecting the incoming strike and in part to her own aircraft being off hitting the American carriers. Also, like other heavily damaged carriers that survived, all the hits were above the waterline. That's not to say it wasn't ugly. Most of the hits, however many, were almost directly midship, wrecking her flight deck, elevator, and hangars. And you can subtract another 150 from the list. 2 large carriers worth of aircrew were wiped out, and the ones that did come back, many were shell-shocked to exhaustion by the volume, accuracy, and lethality of American anti-aircraft, especially the ever-increasing number of Bofors 40mm with radar fire control was making it nearly suicidal to attack American task forces. With the battle over, the carriers returned first to Truk, transferring most of their remaining aircraft to Rabaul, where more would die in battle, and then to Japan, leaving only Junio to cover the upcoming mid-November naval battles of Guadalcanal, along with land-based planes, and then the December-January operations in the Bismarck Sea. Repairs to Zuiho would take until mid-January 1943. Shokaku's repairs would take until May of 1943. Junio could have been joined by the newly converted Ryuho, but on December 12th, while leaving Japan, she was hit by the submarine Drum, sending her back to dock for repairs that would last until mid-February. In late January through early February 1943, Zuikaku and Zuiho returned to the Northern Solomons to join Junio in providing distant cover for the evacuation of Guadalcanal before returning to Truk. Joined by Hio at the end of March, they mostly stayed in the area till May, when they returned to Japan, hooked up with the repaired Shokaku, and prepared to sail north to oppose the American liberation of the Aleutians. But the battle was lost before they could even leave, so the operation was called off. On the evening of June 10, 1943, Hio was hit by 2 torpedoes from the Trigger, sending her back to dry dock for repairs that would last until mid-September. In mid-July, they sailed back to Truk. At the end of October 1943, they transferred most of their air groups to Rabaul and headed back to Japan for upkeep and training. On the morning of November 5, 1943, in the Bungo Strait, Junio was hit by the submarine Halibut. Repairs would last until the end of February 1944. In February 1944, along with most of the fleet, they transferred to the East Indies to be closer to the oil wells and prepare for the next battle. In mid-June 1944, now joined by Taiho and the converted Chiyoda and Chitose, the carriers sailed for the Battle of the Philippine Sea, full of green-as-grass pilots. Again, everyone knows how this went. On the morning of the 19th at 8:10, as she was launching her strike planes, Taiho was hit by 1 torpedo from the submarine Albacore. This cracked the avgas tanks under the forward elevator, causing the elevator well, which was at sea level, to fill with avgas and seawater. Vapor began filling the hangar, but this was thinned out by turning on the internal air circulation system. Nah, it'll be fine. At 11:22, while those green pilots were being shot out of the sky at the Marianas Turkey Shoot, Shokaku herself was hit by 3 torpedoes from Kavala while recovering, arming, and fueling aircraft. Boom! At 2 p.m., she sank bow first. Finally, at about 2:30 p.m., as what was left of the last morning strike was returning, the avgas vapor in Taiho found a spark somewhere and boom! She sank 2 hours later. Oh, by the way, apparently the officer in charge of damage control on Taiho had previously been damage control officer on Akagi. If so, can we give this guy a Medal of Honor for sinking 2 Japanese flagships? The next day, on the evening of the 20th, American carrier aircraft attacked the fleet. Only one 500-pound bomb hit Zuikaku behind the island and exploded in the hangar. Fortunately for her, there were barely any aircraft left, so the ensuing fire was pretty quickly put out, and along with the rest of the fleet, she returned to Japan for repairs via Okinawa. Junio was hit by 2 500-pound bombs, destroying her funnel, damaging her flight deck, and starting fires. Repairs would take until September. Chiyoda took 1 500-pound bomb that caused minimal damage, but repairs would take a month. Hio was hit by 2 500-pound bombs, but this was superfluous because 1 aerial torpedo hit her starboard side, flooding her engine rooms, which left her dead in the water. It also started fires, which eventually reached her avgas. Boom! She sank at 7:30 p.m. With repairs and modifications completed in early August 1944, now joined by Unryo and Amagi, they mostly engaged in training until September 20th, when, only days after the completion of Katsuragi, Zuikaku, Chiyoda, and Chitose sailed for the Battle of Cape Engano. The rest were left behind due to inadequate speed, inadequate fuel, and inadequate aircraft. Between the four carriers, they had just 115 aircraft, mostly on Zuikaku. On the morning and afternoon of October 25, 1944, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chiyoda, and Chitose fought their last fight, fulfilling their mission of sacrificial decoy. And it was all for nothing. At Samar, the overwhelming Japanese fleet turned back. I'm not saying I believe it, but I could understand why some people would ask if the Japanese Navy wanted to win the war or if they just wanted to lose honorably. At the end of October to the end of November, Junyo ran supplies to the East Indies, then back home, with a stopover in Manila. On November 19th, Japan jumped the shark with Cousin Oliver and Richie's older brother watching while the fridge was nuked in the background by officially commissioning the incomplete Shinano. 10 days later, Archer Fish sunk her. Anyway, at the end of November, Junyo again tried to run supplies to Manila. While sailing through the East China Sea in the pre-dawn hours of December 9th, she was jumped by an American wolf pack and hit by 2 torpedoes from Redfish. One knocked out the starboard engine room, while the other wrecked her bow. Limping back into port the next day, she was partially repaired, but written off. On December 19th, while running supplies to Manila, Unryu was sunk by Redfish, 200 miles southeast of Shanghai. At the start of January 1945, Ryuho transported Okas to Taiwan, then returned home. On the morning of March 19, 1945, Ryuho was heavily damaged in an airstrike at Kure. Essentially, she was deemed not worth repairing. The immobilized Amagi and Katsuragi were attacked at Kure on July 28th. Katsuragi was moderately damaged, and Amagi rolled over the next day. Kasagi, Aso, Ikoma, and the light cruiser Ibuki were never completed.